They said the man on the hill had enough money to buy anything except peace. One overcast morning, he showed up at the door of the small boarding house with a proposal no one would dare believe. He would pay $5 million for an unknown young woman to bear the child he couldn't have on his own. The rumor spread fast, cutting through the town like a cold wind between the adobe and wood houses. But no amount of chatter could translate the true story hidden behind that desperate decision. The story of two broken hearts that fate would bring together in a way neither of them could have imagined. This is a story about losses that turn into encounters, about contracts that become promises, and about how healing often begins exactly where we thought everything had ended. Subscribe to the channel for heartwarming stories every day. The Saint. Benedict Ranch occupied the north slope of town like a silent sentinel. Seen from below, with its well-maintained fences and red-tiled barn, it looked prosperous and secure. But anyone who drove up the dirt road to the main house could tell something wasn't quite right. Thomas Ferreira always woke before the sun. He'd put on the same canvas pants and thick cotton shirt, pull on his worn boots, and go check on the animals. The cattle were fine. The vegetable garden was productive. The hired hands, 2 older men and a cook who came 3 times a week, did their jobs without much conversation. Everything functioned as it should, but the house remained empty. It had 7 large rooms, windows overlooking the valley, a porch where Thomas's mother used to knit in the evenings. Now only the wind came in. He ate alone at the long table, the clinking of his spoon against the plate his only company. At night, he'd sit in the worn leather armchair and watch the fire die down in the hearth. Thomas was 37, broad-shouldered from a lifetime of hauling hay and firewood, his hands calloused, his expression rarely changing. His face was the kind that commanded respect in town, not out of arrogance, but from a contained sadness no one dared to ask about. It had been 5 years since his fiancée left him. She'd learned about the diagnosis even before their wedding. The doctor had been clear, a rare, irreversible condition. Thomas would never be able to have children. The news had fallen on him like a stone at the bottom of a well, and on her too, but in a different way. 3 weeks after the diagnosis, she'd returned the simple silver ring and left for the city without looking back. "I wanted a real family, Thomas," she'd said, her voice firm. "You understand, don't you?" He'd understood, or tried to. But the pain remained. Then came the losses. His father, a sudden heart attack in the fields. His mother, 6 months later, as if her body had decided to follow him. The ranch had been left to Thomas. Good land, a respected name, enough money, but no heir. No child's laughter running among the chickens, no future beyond himself. On that October morning, the sky was heavy with low-hanging clouds. Thomas drank his black coffee standing up, adjusted his straw hat, and stepped out onto the porch. The valley stretched out, green and silent. Down below, the town was waking up slowly, smoke rising from chimneys, the bells of the little church ringing 6 o'clock. He squinted. A decision had been made within him, a decision that had been growing for months like a weed between stones. It was an absurd, desperate, perhaps even immoral idea, but it was the last one he had. Thomas walked down the hill that morning, his hat pulled forward, hands in his pockets. He headed for Mrs. Marta's boarding house, an old 2-story building near the town square, where those from outside, those passing through, those without roots, stayed. He knew a young woman was there. He'd seen her twice at the bakery, serving bread with that quiet, almost invisible way of hers. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her story, but he knew she was alone. And in some twisted way, that seemed enough. The proposal he carried in his chest was simple and monstrous at the same time. $5 million to bear the child he couldn't have. A contract, an agreement, nothing more. He climbed the 3 steps of the boarding house and knocked. Mrs. Marta opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw him. "Mr. Thomas," she said, surprised. "What brings you here?" "I need to speak with the young woman who works at the bakery," he replied, his voice hoarse. "The one who arrived 2 months ago." Mrs. Marta hesitated, but something in his expression made her step back. "I'll get her." And so, amidst the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the cold wind seeping through the cracks, fate began to move. She came down the stairs slowly, her hands wiping her faded fabric apron. She had brown hair pulled back in a simple bun, dark eyes that seemed to have seen too much for 21 years, and a posture that wavered between caution and weariness. Laura Mendez wasn't expecting visitors. She wasn't expecting much of anything, really. When she saw the man in the hat waiting in the cramped little parlor of the boarding house, she frowned. She recognized him from town, the rancher from the hill, the one everyone respected and no one truly knew. "Sir?" she asked, her voice low. Thomas took off his hat, holding it in his hands. For a moment, he seemed unsure where to begin. "May I speak with you in private?" Laura looked at Mrs. Marta, who made a vague gesture and withdrew, but not before casting a warning glance. They were left alone, standing, separated by 10 feet, and an ocean of discomfort. I don't know how to say this," Thomas began, his voice rough. "So I'll be direct." Laura waited, her arms crossed. "I have a ranch. I have resources. But I can't have children." He paused, his jaw tight. "And I need an heir, someone to continue what I've built. Someone to carry on the name." Laura blinked, confused. "I don't see what that has to do with me." "I'm offering $5 million, he said, each word weighing like a stone, "for you to bear a child. My child, a legal contract, with lawyers, witnesses. After the birth, you get the money and can go wherever you want. No obligations." The silence that followed was dense, almost solid. Laura felt a flush rise to her face, not of shame, but of something between indignation and disbelief. "Are you buying a baby?" "I'm paying for a solution," Thomas corrected, but his voice faltered. "I know it sounds terrible, but it's the only way I have left." Laura took a step back, her breathing quickening. "And why me?" "Because you're alone," he replied, and there was a brutal honesty in that. "Because no one will ask difficult questions. And because I saw in your eyes that you understand what it's like to have no choices." The statement cut deep. Laura looked away, her hands tightening on her apron. He was right. She hated to admit it, but he was. She had come to the small town after everything fell apart. Her mother dead in a bus accident, the lingering debts, the rented room she could no longer afford. She came because there was nowhere else to go. She came because starting over alone seemed better than suffocating in the big city. But the money, $5 million. It was more than she'd earn in 10 years of work. It was freedom. It was a future. It was a chance to never depend on anyone again. "What if I refuse?" she asked, her voice trembling. Tomas put his hat back on. "Then I apologize for bothering you, and I'll never bring it up again." He turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Think about it," he said, without looking back. "That's all, just think." And he was gone, leaving Laura alone with the weight of an offer that sounded impossible, but also, strangely and frighteningly, real. She sat on the wooden bench by the window, her legs weak. Outside, the town went about its routine, children running, wagons passing by, the baker opening his shop door. Laura put her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. It wasn't the amount that scared her. It was the fact that for the first time in months, someone had offered her something other than pity. Laura didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, watching the candle burn down slowly on the bedside table. The room was small, clean, but impersonal, as if she herself hadn't dared to make it her own. A suitcase under the bed, 2 changes of clothes on the makeshift clothesline, a prayer book she hadn't opened in weeks. $5 million. The number echoed in her mind like a church bell, but it wasn't just the money, it was the proposal itself. So direct, so cold, so Desperate. Laura recognized desperation when she saw it. She knew its taste, and there was something in that man's eyes that didn't lie. He was asking, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't bear the loneliness that was devouring him any longer. She knew that hunger. She knew it well. For the next 3 days, Laura avoided the farm, but she couldn't avoid her thoughts. She worked at the bakery, her hands on autopilot, kneading dough, wrapping bread, cleaning pans, while her mind spun in circles. What if I accept? What if it goes wrong? What if he changes his mind halfway through? What if the town finds out? Because the town would find out. It always did. The gossip had already started. Mrs. Marta, despite her promised discretion, couldn't resist mentioning to 2 customers that Mr. Tomas had been at the boarding house looking for the outsider girl. That was enough. Within 2 days, half the town was speculating. "They say he wants to get married," a woman murmured in the bakery line. "Nonsense," another retorted. "A man like him wouldn't mix with a girl without a family." Laura pretended not to hear, but every word was a barb. On the 4th night, she gathered her courage and climbed the hill. The dirt road was damp with dew, the full moon illuminating the path. Laura shivered, not from the cold, but from something she couldn't name. She reached the farm gate and hesitated. The big house was lit, smoke rising from the chimney. Before she could retreat, the door opened. Tomas was there, sleeves rolled up, his face tired. He saw her and stood still. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said, his voice low. "I thought so too," Laura replied. He gestured for her to come in. The living room was spacious, simply furnished. A leather sofa, a solid wood table, a worn rug. There was a low fire in the fireplace and the smell of coffee in the air. Laura sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap. Tomas poured 2 cups and sat in the armchair opposite, keeping his distance. "I came to say I accept," Laura said, before her courage could fade. "But with conditions." Tomas looked up, attentive. "I want everything in writing. Lawyer, witnesses, as you said. I want half the money up front, half afterwards, and I want your word that you won't look for me after it's all over." He nodded slowly. "You have my word." Laura took a deep breath. "And one more thing." Her voice trembled. "I don't want this to turn into something sordid. I don't want to feel bought. I want respect." Tomas looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes changed, a layer of hardness falling away, revealing pain beneath. "I would never treat you any other way," he said, and it sounded like a promise. Laura nodded, but didn't move. They remained there, separated by the flickering fire and by all they couldn't say. "Are you afraid?" he asked suddenly. "Always," she replied. "Are you?" Tomas looked at his hands. "Every day." And in that instant, something silent and fragile began to be born between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. 2 survivors looking at each other across the fire. Laura moved into the guest house on the farm a week later. It was a small building, separated from the main house by a rock garden and rosemary beds. It had a bedroom, a small living area with a wood-burning stove, a window overlooking the orchard. Simple, but clean. Tomas had arranged everything: new sheets, a thick blanket, firewood stacked by the door. "If you need anything, just let me know," he had said, standing on the threshold, not entering. Laura had nodded, and he had left. For the first few days, she barely saw him. Tomas worked from dawn till dusk, fixing fences, overseeing the harvest, helping the farmhands. At night, he returned to the main house and stayed there. He respected her space, as if there were an invisible line he wouldn't dare cross. But Laura began to notice small gestures. A basket of fresh bread appeared at her door one morning. Another day, extra firewood. Then a jar of honey with a note. "From the bees on the hillside, good for tea." She didn't know how to respond to this kindness that asked for nothing in return. With time, they began to cross paths. Tomas would appear in the orchard when she was picking oranges. He'd help carry the basket without saying much. Laura would watch him out of the corner of her eye, the way he treated the trees with care, how he adjusted the branches without breaking them. "My father planted these orange trees," he said one afternoon, breaking the silence. "He used to say a fruit tree is a living inheritance." Laura looked at the laden branches. He was right. Tomas smiled, briefly, but he smiled. Little by little, a routine began to weave itself. Laura started helping in the vegetable garden. Tomas taught her how to plant carrots, how to water without waterlogging, how to tell when the soil was good. She, in turn, would cook, not because he asked, but because the silence of the guest house sometimes weighed too heavily. She made simple soups, bread, pumpkin preserves. She'd leave a portion on the porch of the main house. At first, Tomas only thanked her with a nod. But then he started eating with her, sitting on the steps of the guest house, plates on their laps, the sun setting behind the mountains. They talked little, but each other's presence was no longer strange. One evening, while mending a torn hem on her own skirt, Laura noticed Tomas standing by the gate, gazing at the starry sky. "Everything okay?" she asked. He took a moment to reply. "Just thinking how strange it is to have someone around again." Laura lowered her needle. "Strange good or strange bad?" "Good," he said, his voice rough. "Scary good." She didn't know what to say, so she kept sewing. But something inside her settled, like a piece finally clicking into place. Weeks passed. Laura's color returned. Her hands grew steadier. Tomas started to smile more often. Never a lot, but enough for her to notice. The farm seemed to breathe better, as if the land itself knew something was changing. But the town hadn't forgotten. At the weekly market, the stares Laura received were sharp. Women whispered as she passed. Men averted their eyes. The pastor, a white-haired man with a rigid posture, approached her once in the town square. "My child," he said, his voice heavy with warning. "I know life is difficult, but some paths lead to places from which there's no return." Laura lifted her chin. "With all due respect, Pastor, my paths are my own." And she walked on, her heart pounding. Because deep down, she knew the judgment was only just beginning. Rain came without warning one November afternoon. Laura was in the orchard when the first drops fell, fat, cold, violent. Within minutes, the sky opened up. She ran towards the guest house, but tripped over an exposed root and fell to her knees in the mud. A sharp pain shot up her right ankle. She tried to get up, but her leg gave out. "Laura!" Tomas appeared, running, his raincoat soaked. Without a word, he swept her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her into the main house. Closer, safer. He laid her on the living room sofa, his face tight with concern. "Let me see." Laura was trembling, not just from the cold. Her ankle was already swelling, bruised purple on the side. Tomas knelt before her, his fingers firm but careful, examining it. "It's not broken," he murmured, "but it's a bad sprain. Needs a splint and rest." He went to fetch thin boards, clean cloths, and a bowl of warm water. He worked slowly, immobilizing her foot with precision. His hands were large, calloused, but surprisingly gentle. "It'll hurt for a few days," he said, tying the last knot. "But it will heal." Laura watched him, the furrow of concentration on his brow, the way he treated it as if it were the most important thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered. Tomas looked up, and for a moment they held each other's gaze, very close, the sound of the rain filling the silence between them. "Stay here tonight," he said, stepping back. "You can't make it back in this rain." Laura offered no protest. He gave her a thick blanket, made her some herbal tea, and built a roaring fire. Laura curled up on the sofa, her ankle throbbing, but her body finally beginning to relax. That night, the fever hit. Laura woke up sweating, her head heavy, her body aching. She tried to sit up, but everything spun. She heard footsteps, and then Tomas was there, his hand on her forehead. "You're burning up." He brought cold cloths, placing them on her forehead and wrists. He brewed a bitter willow bark tea. He sat in the armchair beside the sofa and stayed all night, watching over her. Laura drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes she opened her eyes and saw him there still, his face tired but alert. Other times she heard him whisper, not to her but to someone who wasn't there, "Don't let her get worse, please." The words were fractured, almost a prayer. Laura wanted to say she was fine, but no sound came out. So she just closed her eyes, letting herself be cared for. By morning, the fever had broken. Laura woke to soft light filtering through the window and the smell of chicken broth in the air. Thomas was in the kitchen, stirring a pot, his shoulders stooped with fatigue. "You didn't sleep," she said, her voice hoarse. He turned, and there was relief in his eyes. "You're better. That's what matters." Laura sat up slowly, her ankle still sore, but less swollen. Thomas brought a bowl of broth, sat beside her, and waited for her to eat. "Why did you do this?" she asked. "You stayed up all night." "Because I promised you'd be safe here," Thomas replied simply. Laura looked at him, really looked, and she saw not the man who had made an absurd proposal, but someone who was, perhaps, as broken as she was. Someone who cared because he didn't know how to do anything else. "Thomas," she said softly, "thank you." He nodded, but couldn't meet her gaze. And Laura realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that the agreement between them was no longer just an agreement. It was becoming something else. Laura stayed in the main house for 5 days. Thomas insisted. Her ankle needed rest, and the guest house was too far for her to travel safely. He gave her the guest bedroom on the ground floor, a simple room with an iron bed and white linen curtains. During those days, something changed. They began to eat together, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Thomas told stories of the farm, how his grandfather had cleared the land with his own hands, how his mother sang while she cooked, how his father had died in the fields he loved. Laura, in turn, started to open small windows into her own past. She spoke of the mother who had raised her alone, of the accident that had orphaned her, of the loneliness that had come even before the loss. "I always felt like I was just passing through," she confessed one night, sitting at the table, "as if there was no place in the world that was truly mine." Thomas looked at her with silent understanding. "Me neither." And in that simple exchange, a bond solidified. But the town didn't rest. Mrs. Marta, unable to keep her mouth shut, spread that the young lady was living in the big house now. The rumor transformed. Some people thought it romantic, others scandalous. "He ought to marry her then and there," commented the blacksmith. "Marry? A girl with no family, no name?" retorted another. "Only if it's out of obligation." The pastor, concerned about the parish's reputation, decided to act. One clear afternoon, he went up to the farm. Thomas met him on the porch, polite but cool. "Pastor Aurelius, what brings you here?" "My son. I've come out of concern." The pastor clasped his hands. "I know you're a good man, but the young lady... appearances. Appearances are no one's business." Thomas cut in, his voice firm. "But they are. The community talks, and when the community talks, the young lady suffers." The pastor paused. "If there's serious intent, why not make it official?" "A Christian marriage?" Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Pastor, with all due respect, my life is my own." "And her soul?" The question hung in the air. Laura, who had heard everything from the slightly open window, felt her blood run cold. She knew where this was heading. Marriage, lies, papers that would turn everything into a farce. When the priest left, Laura stepped out and found Thomas sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "I heard," she said. He looked up, exhausted. "I'm not going to force you into anything, Laura. This wasn't part of the deal." "I know." She sat beside him. "But maybe we should consider it." Thomas frowned. "Consider what?" "A marriage of convenience, just to silence the town. After it's all over, we can get an annulment." Tomas stared at her, surprised. "You'd do that?" "I would," Laura replied, "because I know you're not using me, and because I trust you." The words came out simply, but they carried weight. Tomas took a deep breath and then did something unexpected. He reached out his hand. "Then let's do this right, with respect, as it should be." Laura took his hand, and the grip was firm, warm, real. But that night, alone in her room, Laura cried. Not from sadness, but from fear. Fear that this marriage of convenience would start to feel real. Fear that in the end, her heart wouldn't know the difference between a contract and a promise. And most frightening of all, fear that his heart wouldn't know either. The wedding happened on a Tuesday at the courthouse in the next town over. No reception, no guests, just Tomas, Laura, the clerk, and 2 witnesses. Tomas's lawyer and the farm's cook, Mrs. Agnes, who cried discreetly during the short ceremony. Laura wore a simple blue cotton dress, her hair down. Tomas, a dark suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. They exchanged cheap silver bands, signed papers, and that was it. Married. On the drive back, neither of them spoke. The town received the news with mixed reactions. Some thought it was sweet after all. Others were suspicious. The priest, relieved, blessed the union at the next mass. But Mrs. Martyr, leaning on the counter of the diner, murmured to a customer, "Too quick a marriage. It's either true love or a scandal in disguise." Laura heard, pretended not to hear, and moved on. The following weeks were strange. She continued to stay at the guest house during the day, but had dinner at the main house. Tomas remained respectful, distant, but something had changed. A new tension, a silent weight. Then, one December morning, the bomb dropped. A black car drove up the dirt road and stopped in front of the farm. Out stepped a thin man, wearing round glasses and carrying a leather briefcase, a Child Protective Services investigator. Tomas came out to meet him, confused. "Mr. Ferreira, I'm Investigator Allen. I received an anonymous tip." Tomas's heart leapt. "A tip? That you married a young woman in a vulnerable situation with the intent of exploitation." The investigator opened his briefcase. "And that there's an intention to have a child under irregular circumstances." Laura, who had come out of the guest house upon hearing voices, paled. "That's preposterous," Tomas said, his voice trembling with anger. "My marriage is legitimate." "It may be, but my job is to verify." The investigator adjusted his glasses. "I'll need to speak with you, alone." Tomas clenched his fists, but Laura touched his arm. "It's all right. I'll talk to him." They went into the main house. The investigator sat at the table, took out a notepad and pen. Laura, on the other side, was trembling inside but kept her posture straight. "Mrs. Ferreira," he began, "was this marriage of your own free will?" "It was." "Did Mr. Ferreira offer you money?" Laura hesitated. Lying would be a crime, but telling the truth, "He did," she replied firmly, "and I accepted, but not out of exploitation, by choice." The investigator wrote, "And is there an expectation of pregnancy?" "There is." "Do you understand that if coercion or exploitation is proven, the court can intervene, including removing the child?" Laura felt the world spin. "There is no coercion," she said, her voice breaking. "I chose this. No one forced me." The investigator studied her for a long time. "I will investigate. I'll be back in 2 weeks. If there are any irregularities, the marriage may be annulled and legal action taken." And he left, taking with him the little piece Laura and Tomas had built. When they were alone, Laura collapsed into a chair. "It was the priest," she whispered, "or someone from town. Someone reported us." Tomas knelt before her. "I won't let them take this from us. I won't." Laura looked up, tears streaming down her face. "And if they do, if we lose everything?" Tomas held her hands, firm, warm, desperate. "Then we fight, together." And for the first time, Laura realized it was no longer a contract. It was a promise. The following days were filled with silent anguish. Laura couldn't eat properly. Tomas worked himself to exhaustion, but the weight on his shoulders was visible. At night, they sat on the porch, side by side, not knowing what to say. "I ruined everything," Laura murmured one of those nights. "If I hadn't accepted—" "Stop," Tomas interrupted. "It wasn't you, it was me. I made the absurd proposal. I put you in this situation." Laura turned to him. "But I accepted. And now I don't know if I did it just for the money anymore." Tomas froze. "What do you mean?" Laura took a deep breath, her hands trembling. "I mean that somewhere between the cast on my foot and the caldo de gallina you made, I stopped thinking of it as a deal." Her voice faltered, "and I started thinking of it as something real." Tomas closed his eyes, his jaw tight. "Laura, I know this wasn't in the plan," she continued, tears falling. "I know you chose me because I was convenient. But I started to care. And that scares me, Tomas. It scares me a lot." He was silent for too long. Then slowly he reached out and touched her face, his thumb wiping away a tear, the touch almost reverent. "You think it was just convenience?" His voice was rough. "Laura, I was dead inside for 5 years, and then you appeared, scared, angry, beautiful, and suddenly the house wasn't empty anymore. Suddenly I woke up wanting to see your face. Suddenly," he paused, his eyes welling up. "Suddenly I didn't want an heir anymore. I wanted you," Laura sobbed, covering her mouth. "Then what do? "We fight," Tomas said, firm. "Not for a contract, for us, for real." And then, for the first time, he kissed her, slowly, carefully, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. When they broke apart, Laura rested her forehead against his. "I'm afraid of losing this." "Me too. But I won't give up. Never." In the following days, Tomas acted. He contacted the lawyer, gathered documents, requested statements. The town doctor certified that Laura was healthy and happy. Mrs. Agnes wrote an emotional letter about Tomas's transformation. Even the blacksmith, who had seen how Tomas treated Laura at the market, testified in their favor. Laura, meanwhile, wrote a letter to the investigator, sincere, raw, true. "I came to this town with nothing. No family, no future, no hope. Mr. Verrera offered me a chance. He spoke with neighbors, with the priest, with the doctor. In the end, he put the papers away and sighed. I won't deny the situation is unusual, but I don't see exploitation. I see two people trying to rebuild their lives." He looked at both of them. "The case is closed, but please take care of each other, for real." "No," Tomas corrected, holding her tight. "Now it's begun." Tomas and Laura were notified. "It would be good if you attended to clarify things." Laura didn't want to go, but Tomas insisted. "We're not going to hide. We didn't do anything wrong." "Ferreira, the floor is yours." "I'm not asking for your approval," Tomas continued, "but I am asking for your respect. Laura is not a victim. She is my wife, and I love her. I saw this man lose everything, and I saw him reborn when she arrived. If that's not God's work, I don't know what is." Tomas and Laura ran for the pickup truck, but the rain caught them, violent, cold. "Pull over at the church," Laura yelled. Tomas swerved, parking in front of the little church. They went inside, soaked, breathless. Inside, other people were also taking shelter, including the priest. The storm roared outside, thunder shaking the walls. Laura shivered, not just from the cold. Tomas took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. "You were right," she said softly. "We needed to come." People emerged, returning to their homes. Tomas and Laura were the last to leave. At the church door, Laura stopped. "Tomas, what you said about loving me." The vegetable beds were lush, the orange trees laden with fruit, the cattle fat and healthy. But the biggest change wasn't in the land. It was in the big house. Laura no longer lived in the guest house. She had moved permanently into the master bedroom next to Tomas. The space, once cold and empty, now had fresh flowers on the small table, new curtains she had sewn herself, books stacked by the bedside. Tomas would wake and find her reading on the porch, her bare feet up, her hair loose. She would look up and smile, that smile that still caught him by surprise, that still made his chest ache. "Good morning," she'd say. "Good morning," he'd reply. And everything felt simple, right? The town, little by little, accepted them. Some would never accept them. That was inevitable. But others began to greet them at the market, to ask how things were going, to bring small gifts, a jar of jam, an embroidery, flower seeds. Donna Inez wept with emotion, seeing the table in the big house full again, not just with food, but with laughter, conversation, life. Laura began teaching reading to the town's children twice a week on the ranch's porch. Tomas built small benches, set up a little chalkboard. The children loved it, and with them came the mothers, less suspicious, more open. "She's good with them," one of the mothers commented to her husband. "Yeah, and he's good with her. But I regret taking so long to realize it wasn't an heir I needed. It was you. It would be perfect." But Tomas held her hand tightly, as if afraid she might vanish. When they reached the farmhouse, he lifted her into his arms and spun her around, once, twice, laughing. "We're going to have a baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "A baby, Laura." "Our baby," she corrected. And it was true. No longer the child he had bought, the child she had sold, but the child they had chosen together, born from the crooked love that had mended itself along the way. The following months were filled with preparation. Tomas renovated one of the bedrooms, painting the walls a soft, buttery yellow, building a wooden crib with his own hands. Laura sewed diapers, blankets, tiny outfits. Donna Inez knitted non-stop, her eyes shining. The whole town was abuzz. When Laura went into labor one September night, Tomas rushed to fetch the midwife. The birth was long, but uncomplicated. And when the baby's cry echoed through the big house, Tomas collapsed into a chair, weeping with relief. "It's a girl," the midwife announced, placing the infant into Laura's arms. Laura looked at her daughter, small, red, perfect, and felt her heart explode. Tomas knelt beside the bed, gently touching the tiny head. "What will we call her?" Laura smiled, exhausted. "Hope," because that's what she was. Hope born from despair, life born from pain, love born from an absurd bargain that God had transformed into a miracle. Years later, as Hope ran through the orchard, laughing and picking apples, Tomas and Laura sat on the porch, watching. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" Laura asked. "How it all began?" "She'll understand what matters," Tomas replied, "that we love her and that we're a family." Laura smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Yes, we are." And there they remained, under the blue sky of the Sunnybrook Ranch, three hearts where before there had only been loneliness. Because sometimes God uses even the crookedest plans to write the most beautiful new beginnings, and this was theirs. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to receive new stories every day. What would you do in their place? Comment and share with someone special.